Leading up to June of 2018, Australian teenager Larissa Bilby had started dating career criminal Zlatko Sikorski, aged 34. At the time, while reportedly trying to escape an abusive boyfriend, Bilby was living in a halfway home for runaway and at-risk teens. She lied to Sikorski about her age and had recently confessed to friends that she was terrified about the man finding out, as she knew he had a gun. Sikorski had a criminal history dating back to 2005, and which included counts of domestic violence, extortion, and armed robbery. He'd made over 20 court appearances across the state of Queensland. In 2016, he was given a 4-year sentence at Brisbane court after being convicted of 4 counts of extortion, deprivation of liberty, and armed robbery. He was paroled in 2017, but a return to custody warrant was issued the following year after he'd violated the terms of his release, creating a concern for public safety. Bilby was last seen leaving the halfway home in Sandgate, Brisbane, with Sikorski on June the 15th. She was reported missing on June the 24th. Later in the month, local law enforcement found the body of a young female stuffed in a barrel in the back of an abandoned pickup truck. The body had been mutilated beyond recognition, but forensics eventually identified it as Bilby's. Sikorski was tracked down to an apartment complex in Queensland's Sunshine Coast following a 2-day manhunt. After a standoff lasting roughly 27 hours, he was taken into custody. Subsequent investigative efforts revealed that at some point in the last week of June, Sikorski had gruesomely tortured the teen. The man was arrested on a plethora of charges that included murder, torture, misconduct with a corpse, and obstructing a police officer. On November the 10th of 2020, while awaiting trial at Walton Correctional Facility, Sikorski and an inmate named Isaac Martin were standing outside their neighboring cells while a search was carried out. CCTV showed the two men seemingly talking amicably before Martin suddenly struck Sikorski in the head and neck. The latter wobbled for 10 seconds and told another inmate he was fine before collapsing and hitting his head. He died 10 days later from a traumatic brain injury. A psychiatric report indicated that Martin, at the time in his late 20s, had psychopathic tendencies, a narcissistic personality, and that he prided himself on his violence. He was reportedly paranoid that Sikorski, whom he described as his best friend, was trying to kill him, but still couldn't fully explain the attack when questioned. It was suspected that the fatal bashing might have been a form of retaliation for Bilby's death, as upon learning of Sikorski's passing, Martin reportedly laughed and told correctional officers it was karma for what he did to that young kid. He was subsequently sentenced to 11 years in prison. Number 6. Christopher Beltran and Dominique Gonzalez. Law enforcement in New Mexico responded to reports of a shooting at an address in Roswell on the evening of June the 26th of 2021. Upon arriving at the scene, officers found 34-year-old Dominique Gonzalez dead from a gunshot wound to the head. A witness who claimed to have been with the victim all day reported that the perpetrator had been her boyfriend, who had recently been released from prison. The man in question, Christopher Beltran, was by multiple accounts a career criminal. He pleaded guilty to unlawful taking of a motor vehicle in 2018 and was imprisoned again after being released on parole because he was found in the possession of a 9mm pistol. Beltran was let out 12 days early in September of 2020 through an executive order by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, issued to stop the spreading of COVID-19 in the prison system. He was returned to prison for another violation in the fall of 2020 before he was released on June the 22nd of 2021. Within 4 days, he shot and killed Gonzalez. Phone records indicated that prior to being let out, Beltran had called Gonzalez and told her, "I forced my way into your life, and now you can't get me out of it all." The woman didn't want to give him her address, but Beltran threatened that he would find her and kick her door down. The authorities became aware of the threatening phone calls only after the woman's death. Beltran eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and in February of 2023 was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The case would become central to a governor race, as Republican challenger Mark Ronchetti released ads attacking Governor Grisham, alleging she'd released Beltran early on 2 occasions, the latter of which doomed Gonzalez. Documents would, however, indicate that his second release hadn't been early, but in accordance with Beltran having served his sentence. Ronchetti eventually lost the race to Grisham. Number 5. Andrew Charles Beard and Elisa Ann Burkett. In May of 2023, Texas man Andrew Charles Beard, aged 36, was jailed for 43 years after pleading guilty to charges of cyberstalking using a dangerous weapon resulting in death and discharging a firearm during a crime of violence. By the summer of 2020, he and 24-year-old Elisa Ann Burkett were embroiled in a heated legal battle over custody of their daughter. Aided by his former fiancée, Holly Ann Elkins, Beard launched a campaign of harassment against Burkett in which he initially tried to get her arrested. The duo bought a GPS device and installed it on Burkett's car. In late July of 2020, Elkins called the police and, using a fake name, claimed to have spotted Burkett driving dangerously. Less than a month later, she made up claims to have been attacked by Burkett's mother in Burkett's presence. In an effort to get the young mother in trouble with the police, Elkins planted illegal drugs and a handgun with an erased serial number in the trunk of her car. Beard then called 911 under a fake name to report that the woman was selling drugs out of her car. He used a photo of Burkett's license plate, which had been taken, and texted to him by Elkins. Burkett was questioned by the police, but she vehemently denied being a drug trafficker and expressed suspicions that Beard had planted the illegal substances. Throughout September, Beard and Elkins made preparations for Burkett's murder. Between September the 13th and the 19th, the duo bought a van, makeup for Beard's disguise, a knife and shotgun shells. On October the 2nd, while in blackface and wearing a fake beard, Beard approached Burkett as she sat behind the wheel of her vehicle in the parking lot of her workplace in Carrollton. Beard shot the woman in the head and, as she staggered out of the vehicle, stabbed her 13 times in the upper body, killing her. Elkins was at home with Beard's daughter and, upon being questioned by the police a few days later, lied that Beard was with them in an effort of securing an alibi for him. Pieces of the disguise he'd used were found in Beard's home and the DNA on them incriminated him. Elkins was arrested and faced charges of conspiracy to stalk, stalking using a dangerous weapon resulting in death, and brandishing a firearm, which could potentially result in 2 consecutive life sentences. Number 4. Harold Thompson and Gabriella Gonzalez. On May the 10th of 2023, CCTV captured Harold Thompson and Gabriella Gonzalez, both in their 20s, arguing near a gas station on the 800 block of South Walton Walker Boulevard in Dallas, Texas. Thompson's criminal history indicated that he'd recently been charged with domestic assault. Gonzalez's family claimed that the report had been filed in March, but they'd never heard back from Dallas police. The affidavit read that Thompson had beat her up multiple times throughout the entirety of their relationship. As reported by Gonzalez's family, Thompson was abusive and controlling towards his partner as he managed everything for her, took away her cell phone, and forbade her from talking to anyone. Speaking of the 26-year-old's distress, her sister, Melanie Rubio, was quoted as saying, "She would always tell me that she wanted to leave but that she couldn't." During the CCTV-recorded May incident, Thompson was seen by a witness trying to place Gonzalez in a chokehold. He then pulled out a handgun and shot the mother of 3 in the head. After she'd collapsed, Thompson fired several more rounds into her body before fleeing. He was arrested and held without bond at the Dallas County Jail. Thompson, who'd reportedly beaten Gonzalez while she was pregnant with his child, was enraged because she'd recently been on a trip to Colorado where she'd terminated the pregnancy. Number 3. Deborah Locke and Andrew Hodson. On April the 23rd of 2022, a heated argument between Deborah Locke and Andrew Hodson spilled into the street from their home in Manchester, England. The police had been called to the couple's residence 4 times in the past because of their violent domestic disputes. Locke was at the time intoxicated on alcohol and amphetamines. As reported by neighbors who'd witnessed the row, after she'd thrown several of Hodson's belongings into the street, Locke re-emerged carrying a silver hammer. The woman, who was in her early 40s at the time, forcefully struck Hodson in the shoulder and then in the head. He collapsed in the street and Locke geared up to deliver a 3rd strike, but a bystander stopped her. The woman was described as having a vacant look on her face and heard shouting, "He beats me up and strangles me." She was taken into custody while Hodson was rushed to the hospital. He spent 10 days in the intensive care unit and required urgent medical intervention after having suffered a depressed fracture to his cranium. The man eventually recovered. In the doomed relationship, according to her defense, Locke had suffered innumerable instances of abuse and violence before erupting into a violent episode of her own. Locke had previously spent 12 months in prison following a 1997 grievous bodily harm conviction. She also pleaded guilty to grievous bodily harm for the attack on Hodson and was sentenced to 22 months in prison. The judge agreed that Locke had been abused by her partner but justified the custodial sentence by arguing that the hammer attack wasn't in self-defense but in retaliation for how he'd treated her. Number 2. Rebecca and Noel Payne. In the spring of 2023, Australian woman Rebecca Payne faced a sentence of life imprisonment after she was found guilty of murdering her husband, 68-year-old Noel. The woman, who was in her early 40s at the time, had given her spouse lemon biscuits, the icing of which she'd laced with crushed temazepam sleeping pills. After Noel died, she stuffed his remains in the freezer of their home in Walpiup. After 3 days in September of 2020, the body was discovered by law enforcement. During Rebecca's murder trial, her defense argued that she'd been physically abused and emotionally controlled by her husband for years. Noel would routinely beat Rebecca and force himself on her, and he'd made her get his name tattooed on her body a total of 18 times. At one point in their relationship, Rebecca left her husband but then decided to try and save the marriage. Upon returning, she found that Noel had moved a younger woman with whom he was having intimate relations into their home. The trio continued living together. During a victim impact statement, Noel's second partner told the court that he subjected her to the same abuse that Rebecca had suffered, including forcing her to tattoo herself with his name 5 times. Rebecca denied murder during her trial, claiming she'd only wanted to make Noel pass out. On March the 15th of 2023, a Supreme Court jury found her guilty. The sentencing judge argued that she deserved a level of mercy given the abusive relationship lasting over a decade with her husband. She was ultimately sentenced to 16 years in prison with a non-parole period of 10 years. We have 7 more cases from a previous video lined up for you immediately after number 1. Stay tuned if you'd like to. Number 1. For Zaya, Javid and Kashif Anwar. On September the 2nd of 2021, British woman Zaya Javid fell 50 feet from Arthur's Seat, an ancient volcano in Edinburgh, Scotland. She'd gone to the natural landmark in the evening accompanied by her husband, Kashif Anwar. Javid, who was 17 weeks pregnant at the time, suffered devastating injuries in the fall. A witness rushed to help her and the young woman told them, "Don't let my husband near me, he pushed me." Javid was alive long enough to tell a responding officer that her husband had pushed her from the hillside outcrop because she wanted to end their marriage. Javid's condition rapidly deteriorated after the fire department joined in the rescue effort. She became unresponsive and passed away. She and Anwar had met in Leeds, England, while the woman worked as an optical assistant. They got married on December the 25th of 2020 and moved to a home in Pudsey. Within weeks, as reported by her family, Javid wanted out of the marriage, as Anwar had become increasingly abusive towards her. He was frequently violent and monitored his spouse's communications to the point that Javid set up a text code with her mother, the sentence, "I like cream cakes," to let her know when she needed help. Javid had reported her husband to the police prior to the Edinburgh trip. While going through the instances of violence she'd suffered, she noted an incident in which Anwar knocked her unconscious in a graveyard, and another in which he placed a pillow over her head and punched it repeatedly. Anwar had also reportedly stolen over $15,000 from her bank account while she was sleeping. The man denied killing Javid and maintained that she'd fallen, but prosecutors used her previous testimony to expose the abuse she'd endured during the relationship. Anwar was found guilty of murder and given a life sentence, with a mandatory imprisonment period of at least 20 years. Number 9. Fernando Monera. In May of 2021, a woman was fatally stabbed at her apartment in Harlem, New York City, by her ex-boyfriend. 26-year-old Fernando Monera had met his on- and off-girlfriend, Alanya Hardy, aged 27, after she'd moved into the same apartment complex. They began dating shortly thereafter, but had a toxic relationship that led to several breakups and reconciliations. Friends, neighbors, and family spoke about how Monera was jealous, aggressive, and controlling towards Hardy, and they encouraged her to leave the relationship. The woman was ultimately granted a restraining order after Monera broke into her apartment on the top floor and aggressively held her captive in February of 2021. She eventually managed to escape and call the police, and Monera trashed her apartment in anger. Despite the restraining order, Monera continued living in his ground floor apartment in the same complex. A few months later, on May the 19th, Monera tried to break into Hardy's apartment yet again. She called the police asking for help, but the man left before officers arrived at her apartment. Monera subsequently returned and gained access to her home through the fire escape. He attacked Hardy, stabbing her multiple times. She put up a fight and inflicted injuries to Monera's chest and neck that left him in critical condition. The woman was rushed to the hospital where she succumbed to her knife wounds. Monera recovered and was subsequently charged with murder, burglary, and criminal contempt. Number 8. Samantha Stanford. On June the 14th of 2015, a woman by the name of Samantha Stanford brutally stabbed her boyfriend after they'd returned home from a party in Henrietta, Oklahoma. 20-year-old Stanford had a toxic 3-year on and off relationship with her boyfriend Anthony Hall, age 23. Stanford had moved into Hall's house for a while, and despite being broken up the night of the party, they were still living together. While at the party, Stanford became upset after seeing text messages on Hall's phone from another woman. After the pair had returned to Hall's home, Stanford noticed even more texts on the man's phone from the same woman. It was at that point that Stanford went to the kitchen for a drink. She returned to the bedroom with 2 knives and stabbed Hall multiple times before calling the police to report the incident. Officers arrived at the scene to find the man dead and Stanford covered in his blood as she admitted to killing him. She was arrested and charged with murder, leading to a conviction in April of 2016 and a consequent sentence of life in prison without parole. Number 7. Michael Marapace. On March the 13th of 2019, a man murdered his ex-girlfriend in her Rhode Island home after a tense 2-year-long relationship. 40-year-old Michael Marapace, who had been in and out of jail for the majority of his life, killed Lauren Iser after his most recent release. While Marapace's longtime friend insisted that he wasn't a violent person, Iser's family members had a completely different take on the situation, stating that they had a hostile relationship riddled with warning signs. The day before her murder, 29-year-old Iser had called the police after Marapace had showed up to her home. He'd reportedly banged on the windows, threatening to kill her, and driven in circles around her neighborhood. Marapace had even knocked on her neighbors' doors, asking them if Iser was dating anybody else. Once the police arrived, the woman explained that she had a restraining order against her ex. However, when police tried to confirm her report, they found that the restraining order was actually put in place against her by Marapace. For that reason, officers claimed they were unable to do anything and left. In their absence, Marapace broke into Iser's home, killed her, and later confessed the murder to a friend. The latter alerted the police, who found the victim dead in her bedroom. Marapace was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. As of the latest available information, he was being held without bail as he awaited trial. Number 6. Thomas Nutt. Dawn Walker was killed by her new husband, a man by the name of Thomas Nutt, on their wedding night on October the 27th of 2021. There were signs of trouble before they'd even gotten married, and Nutt had served time in prison for assaulting Walker roughly a year before their wedding. Friends and family had warned the woman to leave the relationship because he was dangerous. Neighbors constantly heard Nutt yelling at Walker and noticed that he was possessive and controlling of her. After the wedding, Nutt claimed to have taken Walker on a honeymoon trip to Skegness, England. Upon their supposed return, Walker didn't show up to a meeting she'd previously planned with her daughter, who couldn't get a hold of her. When her daughter asked Nutt where she was, he reportedly acted as though he had no idea and even helped her look for Walker. When she didn't turn up, they reported her missing, and Nutt had tried to make it sound as though Walker was mentally ill and battling a drinking problem. In reality, he'd killed her just hours after their wedding and had subsequently broken her legs to have her fit inside a suitcase that he later dumped in a field near their home. On August the 19th of 2022, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 21 years. Number 5. Hannah Sindri. In the early hours of January the 1st of 2021, mother of 2 Hannah Sindri stabbed her boyfriend at her Essex apartment in England. 24-year-old Sindri was hosting a New Year's Eve party when her boyfriend, Paul Fletcher, took her phone after being suspicious of her cheating on him. An argument broke out that culminated with Sindri grabbing a kitchen knife and stabbing 31-year-old Fletcher in the chest, killing him at the scene. Witnesses who were present at the party told police that they'd seen Sindri holding the knife and aggressively waving it at Fletcher before stabbing him. Sindri initially tried to pin the murder on her friend, Kelly Blackwell, who was later found not guilty. Sindri and Fletcher's friends told the authorities that they'd argued regularly and that the disputes sometimes turned into violence. In January of 2022, Sindri was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 14 years and 5 months before being eligible for parole. Number 4. Mark Barrett. On August 15th of 2021, a mother was found dead at her home in Leeds, England, by her son in the aftermath of an argument with her husband. Eileen Barrett and her husband Mark Barrett, both in their 50s, were known for having a toxic relationship. Mark was described as a jealous and controlling partner. He'd at one point secretly placed a tracking device in Eileen's purse and would follow her any time she left the house. Eileen had tried to leave the marriage numerous times over the years, but Mark had manipulated her into staying by threatening to take his own life. Eileen finally decided to leave on the night of August the 14th of 2021, and when Mark realized he couldn't manipulate her into staying, he turned to violence. He hit her twice with a hammer and strangled her, leaving her body on the floor of their home before fleeing to Scotland. The police launched a nationwide manhunt and were able to track him down 5 days later in Elgin, where he was arrested. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 21 years served. Number 3. Tafari Walton. In March of 2019, a young mother from Australia was fatally stabbed by her partner, who had a history of violence involving knives. 22-year-old Tafari Walton was high on cocaine when he tied up his girlfriend, Gabriella Thompson, and stabbed her 16 times. Walton had called several of 27-year-old Thompson's friends on the night of the murder. They became concerned for her safety and alerted the authorities. One of the woman's closest friends, Emma Russell, told law enforcement that Walton had a history of being physically violent towards Thompson. After the murder, Walton fled the scene and a day-long manhunt ensued. He was found at Lake Macquarie, New South Wales, where police tried to subdue him with pepper spray. When that failed and Walton charged at an officer with a knife, he was fatally shot. Number 2. Abdel-Jabbar Mahamood. A man was charged with the fatal stabbing of his ex-girlfriend in Ontario, Canada, on February the 9th of 2020. Brittany Newman, aged 25, was in a long-term relationship with 27-year-old Abdel-Jabbar Mahamood, and the pair had 2 young children together. Their troubled relationship had caused Newman to seek help multiple times over the years, and even resulted in her staying in a shelter for a short period of time to get away from Mahamood. At the time of her murder, they'd been broken up for 2 years, and she had been living in her own apartment with their children. The man burst into her home and attacked her with a knife before calling the police. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they found Newman clinging to life after having suffered multiple stab wounds. The authorities arrested Mahamood at the scene, and a short time later, Newman died as a result of her injuries. Mahamood was charged with second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 18 years. Number 1. Tracy Andrews. On December the 1st of 1996, aspiring model Tracy Andrews tearfully described to law enforcement the murder of her fiancé, 25-year-old Lee Harvey, in Worcestershire, UK, by an unknown male assailant. In reality, 27-year-old Andrews herself had stabbed Harvey 42 times with a pocket knife and sliced his throat in the middle of the night on a country lane near their home, where she abandoned him to die of his injuries. She went on to lie about what had happened, stating that a fat man with staring eyes had killed him following a road rage incident. After they'd left a nearby pub, Andrews appeared in court with a black eye, stating that she'd been punched in the face during the attack as she tried to help Harvey. However, an analysis by forensic psychologist Kerry Danes revealed that Andrews was lying, and the ensuing investigation proved that her story didn't add up. The model became the primary suspect in her husband's killing and was arrested a few days later. In 1997, she was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 14 years. 2 years into her sentence, she admitted to killing Harvey in an act of self-defense. Andrews was released after serving her sentence and eventually got engaged to another man. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be trapped in a loveless marriage or a moneyless career? Let us know in the comments section below.